policeman hit Bruce Lee with a baton, but after a few seconds regretted it. Watch to the end and you will be shocked. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments from where you watch this video. The sun hung high above downtown Los Angeles, casting sharp angles of light across the paved expanse of Pershing Square. The city pulsed as it always did. Joggers traced their usual loops, office workers on break clustered near food trucks, and tourists wandered between the manicured hedges and fountain jets, pointing cameras and sipping iced drinks. The distant sounds of car horns and sirens formed a background hum beneath the square's livelier rhythm. Amidst all this movement, there was one point of stillness. Beneath the wide, lavender-spilled shadow of a jacaranda tree sat a man on an iron bench. His posture was relaxed but precise. His legs were crossed. One hand rested gently on a worn hardcover book, the other slowly turning its pages. His clothes were plain: a gray jacket with frayed sleeves, a simple white shirt, dark jeans. On his head, a cap cast a shadow that concealed much of his face. No one gave him a second glance. He blended in seamlessly with the park's scenery, until one looked more closely. The man was Bruce Lee. His name once lit up movie screens across continents. His movements had redefined martial arts for generations, but here, now, decades after his supposed passing, he sat unnoticed in the center of the city, as still and present as the stone bench beneath him. He had no phone, no earbuds, no distractions. Just the quiet rustle of turning paper and the occasional flutter of pigeons near his feet. Bruce did not seek attention. He never had. Not truly. In a world that craved noise, his silence was unnerving to those who didn't understand it. One man, in particular, did not understand. Captain Miles Renner had just exited City Hall 2 blocks away. His uniform was immaculate. Pressed navy blue fabric, rows of polished brass pinned across his chest, and the gold star of rank that gleamed under the sun like a badge of judgment. Renner had built his career on command. He spoke, others listened. He appeared, others stood straight. His authority wasn't just expected, it was assumed. As he strolled into Pershing Square, scanning the space with the instinctive vigilance of a career officer, his gaze passed over the food carts, the kids playing tag, the street musician near the north gate. Then, his eyes stopped on the still figure beneath the jacaranda tree. A man, alone, sitting for no clear reason. Not on lunch break, not playing with children, not even on his phone, just sitting. Renner's eyes narrowed. Something about the man didn't sit right with him. The stillness, the calm, it wasn't natural. It was too intentional, too self-assured. It radiated a quiet control that challenged Renner's need to dominate every space he entered. He adjusted the fit of his service cap and started walking directly toward the bench. Bruce didn't look up. With every heavy footstep on the paved walkway, Renner made his presence known. His boots struck with deliberate weight. He moved like a man used to announcing himself with posture alone. 10 feet, 5, 3. Still no reaction. Renner stopped directly in front of the bench. His shadow fell over Bruce's book. The sun glinted off the silver buckle of his duty belt, where a baton, handcuffs, taser, and sidearm hung with perfect balance. He squared his stance. "You can't sit here all day," Renner said, his voice level but laced with superiority. Bruce didn't turn the page. He simply kept his eyes on the open book, unmoving. Renner raised an eyebrow. "Sir," he repeated, louder now, "this area's not for loitering. You need to move along." Still no reaction. Not even a twitch. Renner felt the first spark of irritation. Most people responded by now, nodded, apologized, stood up, avoided confrontation. But this man, He sat as though Renner hadn't spoken at all, as if he were invisible. Worse, irrelevant. Renner took a step closer, the polished leather of his boot nearly touching Bruce's own. "Do you understand me?" Bruce finally moved. He reached up and slowly adjusted the brim of his cap, just enough for his eyes to be visible beneath it. They met Renner's gaze. It was not a look of defiance. It was not fear. It wasn't even curiosity. It was recognition. As if Bruce had already measured him before the first word was ever spoken. Renner's jaw tightened. "I gave you an order," he snapped. Bruce's voice, when it came, was quiet, almost gentle, but firm. "You gave me a statement, not a reason." A nearby couple walking their dog paused and glanced over. A young man sitting on the edge of the fountain began recording on his phone, sensing something about the scene that was no longer casual. Renner squared his shoulders, his pride now stung. "You're interfering with public space. You're loitering. I'm reading. In a restricted area. There's no sign. You're being uncooperative." Bruce blinked once, slowly. Is calm the same as defiance now? The calmness in Bruce's voice cut deeper than any insult. It wasn't the words. It was the fact that he didn't fear Renner, and that, for the captain, was a rare and dangerous thing. Renner took another step closer, towering now. "I won't ask again." Bruce closed the book, not angrily, not quickly, just closed it. The tension in the square had shifted. It was no longer just a conversation. People were watching. Phones were raised. A teenager in a Lakers hoodie whispered something to his friend. A street vendor stopped mid-order to listen. Renner felt the eyes. He was used to being watched, but only when he was in control. And something about this man, this unshakable, silent man, was threatening to unravel that control one heartbeat at a time. "You have 10 seconds to comply," Renner said, his voice hardening. Bruce didn't rise. He didn't flinch. He simply looked at Renner and said 5 words. "Then count them carefully, officer." The air in the Pershing Square grew heavier with each breath. Though the sun still cast its golden light across the pavement and the laughter of children echoed in the distance, the energy around the fountain had changed. A crowd had begun to coalesce without being asked. People sensed the tension. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, watchful. A tension that thrived in silence. Captain Miles Renner felt it. And he hated it. The man in front of him, this quiet, composed figure with the slow breath and the unreadable eyes, had not budged, had not obeyed, had not even acknowledged Renner's rank. He didn't stammer, he didn't flinch, he didn't try to argue, he simply refused. And that, to Renner, was unacceptable. "You think I'm bluffing," he said, his voice sharper now, pitched just high enough for those nearby to hear. "You think this is some kind of game?" The man didn't answer. Bruce Lee sat with his back straight and his hands resting on the closed book in his lap. He didn't smirk. He didn't raise an eyebrow. He just waited. Renner took another deliberate step forward. The space between them was gone now. Only inches separated the captain's badge and Bruce's composure. "I don't care who you think you are," Renner continued. "This park is public property, and I'm giving you a lawful command. You refuse to comply, that's obstruction. Interference. I will not warn you again." Bruce's voice came quietly but with perfect clarity. "Then do what you believe you must." Something about the words, so calm, so measured, landed like a slap. Renner had expected protest, even resistance, but not this complete, deliberate stillness. The crowd was bigger now. Phones were out. At least 4 lenses caught the exchange, blinking red, recording every moment. A teenager zoomed in, A woman holding a stroller glanced nervously between the two men. A vendor leaned against his cart, arms crossed, saying nothing. Renner wasn't worried about the onlookers, not yet. He was worried about the feeling crawling up his spine, the feeling of being out of control. He leaned down, face closer now, voice low and pointed. "What's your name?" Bruce's eyes remained locked on his. "You already know it." The answer caught Renner off guard. No, he thought, that's not possible. But something in the way the man said it stirred a flicker of recognition, an echo from documentaries, old interviews, grainy training footage. But it couldn't be. Bruce Lee was long dead, a legend, a ghost. And yet, here he was, sitting in front of him like a mountain, immovable, real, and terrifying not because of what he might do, but because of what he didn't need to do. Renner straightened. His hand moved to his baton, resting casually against his belt. His fingers curled around the handle. Bruce's eyes tracked the movement, but his expression didn't change. "You think this makes you stronger?" Renner said, tapping the baton once. "No," Bruce replied, still seated, "but it shows me your weakness." That did it. Renner's face tightened, his jaw clenched, his pride burned. He pulled the baton from his belt with a sharp, practiced motion and raised it slightly, not to strike, but to intimidate, to claim the space. The crowd murmured. The camera phones followed every gesture. Bruce's hands remained folded. Renner took a step back and brought the baton down, not on Bruce, but on the bench, just an inch from his leg. The crack of impact echoed through the square, loud and sudden. A few birds fluttered from a nearby tree. The sound scattered the momentary quiet. Bruce didn't move, not even a blink. Renner glared down at him. "Did that get your attention?" Bruce finally shifted. Not a retreat, not a reaction, a movement of intention. He slowly adjusted the cap on his head, then met Renner's stare again. "You've made your presence known," he said calmly, "but you still don't understand what that means." Renner gritted his teeth. "Don't play word games with me." "I'm not playing," Bruce replied. "You are." His tone didn't rise. He didn't argue. Yet each word struck deeper than any shout. And that was what infuriated Renner the most. This man's refusal to be rattled. Nearby, two joggers had stopped to watch. A food delivery worker leaned his bike against a post and hit record on his phone. The attention was growing. Renner knew what it looked like, an officer being ignored, his commands dismissed. And that could not stand. Not in uniform. Not in public. "You're obstructing an officer in the performance of his duties," Renner barked. "This is your last chance. Move, or I'll move you." Bruce looked down at the book in his lap, as if weighing whether to respond at all. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet. It was not a rushed movement. There was no tension in his shoulders, no preparation for violence. It was fluid, elegant, effortless. Like standing was just another form of meditation. He stood eye to eye with Renner now. He was taller than expected, not in inches, in presence. Bruce looked at him without threat, without fear, without hate. "Captain," he said quietly, "if you raise your hand again, you will lose something more than just control." Renner froze. For the first time, truly froze. He didn't know why. The man hadn't touched him, hadn't threatened him. But something about those words, the precision of them, the certainty behind them, it went deeper than any shouted threat. Bruce stepped back just once. The bench behind him remained untouched. The book lay calmly on its surface. Renner took a breath. The moment hovered. The entire square held it with him. And then, driven by something primal, something angry and afraid, Renner reached out. He grabbed Bruce's shoulder. It was the last simple movement he would fully understand that day. Captain Renner's hand closed over the stranger's shoulder with firm, practiced pressure. His grip was meant to dominate, to assert final authority. But the moment his fingers curled into the fabric of Bruce's jacket, something shifted. Something subtle, but undeniable. The shoulder didn't flinch. It didn't resist. It absorbed. Renner realized too late that the body beneath his grip wasn't frail, wasn't soft, wasn't yielding. There was strength there, not the puffed-up kind found in gyms or in men who like to bark orders, but the deep-rooted kind, the kind honed by decades of discipline. And then everything moved at once. Before he could even tense his other arm, his wrist was caught in a grip so exact it stunned him. It wasn't violent. It wasn't painful. It was complete. Bruce Lee held him, not to harm, but to stop, to demonstrate that there were levels of control Renner had never imagined. The crowd gasped. A collective breath was held. Renner's fingers twitched instinctively, but his arm wouldn't obey. His wrist tingled under the pressure, his elbow locked in a direction he didn't choose. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from confusion. And then the grip released. Renner stumbled back half a step. His heels scraped the pavement. His balance faltered. His pride cracked. He looked down at his wrist. No bruises. No injury. But the sense of powerlessness clung to it like a phantom burn. The square around him had changed. What had started as a casual confrontation had turned into a spectacle. Dozens of eyes were locked on him, some with pity, some with judgment, some with silent anticipation. His breath came fast now, his chest heaved once, twice. He reached instinctively for his baton, not to think, to act. It was all he had left. He drew it with one practiced pull and raised it. But Bruce didn't move. He didn't prepare to dodge. He didn't even lift a hand. And when Renner brought the baton down in a swift, calculated strike toward Bruce's shoulder, it hit nothing but air. Bruce had shifted. Just a half step, just enough. Renner lost his balance again, and then, with almost surgical precision, his wrist was caught once more. But this time, the baton slipped from his hand. His fingers opened involuntarily, and the weapon was gone. Bruce stood holding it, effortlessly. The silence that followed was thunderous. The crowd that had gathered now buzzed with hushed voices. One person near the food carts muttered a soft, "Oh my God." Another whispered, "Did you see that?" as if their phone recording wasn't already capturing it. Bruce didn't raise the baton. He didn't brandish it. He looked at it briefly, as if weighing its meaning, and then slowly, almost ceremoniously, let it fall to the ground. It landed with a metallic clatter, echoing unnaturally loud in the square. Renner's breath hitched. He stared at the weapon as though it were a piece of himself, discarded and humiliated. His mind raced. What just happened? How? He looked up at Bruce, searching his face for something, mockery, aggression, triumph. But there was nothing. Just that same calm, that same stillness. It made Renner furious. He had been disarmed. Twice. In front of civilians, in front of phones, in front of witnesses. And still, Bruce hadn't even raised a fist. Renner's fingers twitched toward his holster. This time, it wasn't instinct. It was desperation. The gun was his last defense, his final symbol of control. He gripped it, but before the strap could clear, Bruce's eyes narrowed slightly. Not a warning, not a threat, just enough to signal that he saw. He didn't move. He didn't need to. Renner hesitated. For the first time, truly hesitated. But pride has its own gravity. His fingers moved again. This time he pulled the strap loose. He started to draw, and then, again, he was too late. Bruce's hand closed around Renner's wrist like it had been waiting there all along. The grip was precise, unyielding, not painful, but undeniable. Renner's fingers spasmed. The gun fell. He didn't even feel himself let go. It was just suddenly gone. And now Bruce held it. A murmur rippled through the square. Someone gasped aloud. A young woman near the edge whispered, "He took his gun! Oh my God! He took his gun!" Bruce didn't raise it, didn't even turn it toward Renner. He inspected it, turned it over in his palm. Then, just like the baton, he crouched, set it gently on the pavement next to the bench, and stood. His message was unmistakable. "I don't need this, and neither do you." Renner's face flushed with heat. His hands trembled. He could hear the buzz of the phones recording, the cameras zooming. Every second of this was being captured. He had been disarmed twice and still stood powerless. And now the worst part, the part he feared more than any physical blow, he heard footsteps behind him. 2 more officers. They'd seen the crowd, seen the cameras, heard the commotion. They were coming fast. Renner turned, desperate for backup, desperate to reclaim control. As they approached, he pointed toward Bruce. "He assaulted me," Renner barked. "Put him in cuffs, now." The officers stopped short. Both looked at Bruce and froze. The older of the two, a gray-haired sergeant with tired eyes, stared for a second too long. Then recognition dawned. His mouth parted. His stance changed. He knew who Bruce was. He had seen that face before, not just in old footage but in books, in stories, in history. Bruce Lee. Alive. Present. Standing in front of him. The officer didn't draw his weapon. He didn't move forward. He just said one word, softly, with the weight of realization behind it. "Dan." Renner turned. "What?" The sergeant looked at him, and in that moment, Renner saw something he hadn't expected. Pity. "You need to stop," the officer said firmly. Not as a suggestion, as an order. Renner's world collapsed in on itself. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. This was a reckoning, and it wasn't Bruce Lee who would be judged. It was him. Captain Renner stood paralyzed, one foot slightly behind the other, like he'd just been pushed back by something invisible. His mouth was open, caught mid-protest, but no words emerged. His eyes flicked between the 2 officers who had just arrived, men who had served under his command for years, and the stranger who had, without raising a fist, reduced him to this trembling state. The elder officer's words still echoed in his skull. "You need to stop." And he had said it publicly. Renner turned back toward Bruce Lee, but something had changed. He no longer saw a threat. He saw a mirror, one that reflected his own insecurity, his blind use of power, his hunger for compliance. The man who had just unarmed him stood quietly by the bench, calm as ever, as though nothing in the last 5 minutes had required any effort. But the reality was undeniable. Renner had lost complete control of the situation. And now, worse than that, he had lost his audience. Phones were still raised. The footage had not stopped rolling. Social media was already catching fire. He could hear the murmurs around him. Words like disarmed, humiliated, and put in his place floated in the air like ash after a fire. Renner turned sharply to the elder officer, voice cracking with the edge of desperation. "He assaulted me. You saw it. He disarmed me. He took my weapon. He resisted." But the sergeant only looked at him with weary clarity. "I saw you escalate," he replied. "I saw him de-escalate." The younger officer beside him, wide-eyed and uncertain, didn't move. His hand had drifted away from his holster minutes ago. Now he glanced nervously between the two older men, unsure which way justice pointed. Renner's fist clenched. He wanted to scream, to order, to regain some shred of dominance, but the words caught in his throat. His voice had always worked before. His badge had always been enough. Not today. Not with him. Not with Bruce Lee. And now came the final cut. The sergeant stepped forward, not toward Bruce, but toward Renner. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, filled with the weight of an irreversible decision. He stopped just short of Renner, his eyes locked onto his superior's face. "Give me your badge," he said. The sentence landed like a hammer to the chest. The crowd around them gasped in unison. Someone even whispered, "He's really doing it," as if witnessing a fall from royalty. Renner flinched. "What are you talking about?" "You heard me," the sergeant said, "badge and gun." Renner's heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear his own breath. "You're joking." "No," the sergeant said, "I'm not." A deep, unbearable silence followed. The square was a vacuum. The children had stopped playing. The food vendor had stopped serving. The entire world had come to a halt, waiting to see what Captain Renner would do. He stood still, his mouth trembling. For a moment, he looked like he might refuse, might fight back, might declare martial law on the square itself. But that time had passed. Slowly, his hand lifted to the badge clipped to his chest. His fingers trembled slightly as he unpinned it. The metal glinted in the sun, but no longer felt like a symbol of authority. It felt like dead weight. He handed it to the sergeant. Then came the gun. He reached down, unclipped the holster, removed the magazine, cleared the chamber, automatic muscle memory. The weapon he had drawn so many times now felt foreign, almost absurd in his hand. He laid it gently atop the badge in the sergeant's waiting palm, and with that, he was no longer Captain Renner. He was just Dan, just a man in a uniform he no longer had the right to wear. The sergeant gave a small nod, acknowledging the moment. Then he turned to the younger officer. "Escort him off the square." The younger man hesitated, as if unsure whether he had the right. Then, obediently, he stepped beside Renner and placed a light but firm hand on his arm. Renner didn't pull away. He just stood there, trembling. And then he walked. Every step across the square burned like fire. The crowd parted silently, respectfully, letting him pass. No one jeered, no one shouted, but everyone watched, and that was worse. Renner could feel their stares like blades down his back. He kept his head high, but it didn't matter. The eyes around him no longer saw a figure of power. They saw a man who had been defeated without a single punch. A man whose authority had unraveled with each act of his own pride. He reached the edge of the square. The voices behind him resumed slowly, like water after a dam breaks. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The younger officer followed behind quietly, casting one last glance at Bruce Lee. Back at the bench, Bruce remained still. His book was untouched. The baton and gun still lay neatly at the side of the fountain where he had placed them. He made no motion to pick them up. He made no grand gesture. He didn't raise his voice or celebrate. He simply existed, present, unshaken, unmoved. The sergeant approached him now. "I'm sorry that happened," he said. Bruce looked up at him with the same calm eyes. "You don't need to apologize," he said, "but you do need to remember." The officer nodded slowly. "I will." He bent down, retrieved the discarded baton and gun, and walked away without another word. The crowd around Bruce lingered, unsure of what to say or do. Some stood in awe. Others whispered among themselves. The man they had just watched neutralize a police captain hadn't even raised his voice. And somehow that made it even more unforgettable. A young man with a phone still filming slowly lowered it and muttered, "This is gonna go viral in 5 minutes." A father standing beside his son said nothing. The boy tugged on his sleeve and asked softly, "Who was that man?" The father stared at Bruce for a long moment before answering, "Someone you don't mess with." Bruce closed his eyes briefly, letting the last of the tension flow out of his body like a long breath. Then, as if the whole incident had been a passing storm, he reached down, picked up his book, and sat again on the bench. The square returned to motion around him. But nothing would ever be the same. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the skyline of downtown Los Angeles, casting long golden streaks across Pershing Square. The fountain's steady rhythm had returned, bubbling gently as the early evening crowd flowed back into motion. Conversations resumed. Children's laughter rose again. Joggers picked up their pace. But beneath all that normalcy, something profound lingered in the air. Something unspoken, yet undeniable. Bruce Lee sat alone on the bench once more, just as he had before the confrontation. But now, the space around him had changed. It wasn't wider, it wasn't louder, it was quieter, more reverent. People still watched him, but not with suspicion, with awe, with caution, with respect that went beyond fame, respect for what he had just done without ever once raising his hand in violence. The baton and gun that had been dropped earlier were now gone. The sergeant had collected them and left without further word. Former Captain, Renner had been escorted out of the park minutes earlier, his head high but his posture hollow, a man dismantled in front of a city that had once obeyed his every word. Bruce, meanwhile, had returned to his book, but he hadn't turned a page. He simply rested there, present as if letting the square breathe again. A boy approached hesitantly, not more than 10 or 11 years old, dressed in a Lakers jersey and holding a soda in one hand, a phone in the other. His father followed a few steps behind, watching cautiously, but not interfering. The boy stood a short distance from the bench. Sir?" Bruce lifted his gaze slowly, kindly. The boy cleared his throat. That was awesome," he said, voice trembling between fear and admiration. "I mean, you didn't even hit him. You didn't have to. You just made him stop." Bruce didn't smile. He didn't boast. He nodded once, acknowledging the words, then said quietly, "Fightin' is the last language of the lost." The boy blinked. "Huh?" "It means," Bruce continued, "the strongest person in the room is usually the one who doesn't need to prove it." The boy nodded slowly, even if he didn't fully understand. His father stepped forward, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Come on," the man said, offering Bruce a respectful glance. "Let's not bother him." "You're not bothering me," Bruce said gently. "But don't idolize what you saw, understand it." The father paused, then gave a small nod. "I'll try." They left. More people passed by now, whispering quietly, casting glances not of curiosity, but of reverence. One woman even offered a polite "thank you" as she passed. Bruce didn't respond, not out of rudeness, out of understanding. Some moments didn't need conversation. Then came the footsteps again, measured, heavier, older. The sergeant had returned. He wasn't carrying a weapon. His badge had been pinned back to his chest, but it no longer felt like armor. He stopped a short distance from the bench, watching Bruce for a moment before speaking. "You handled that differently than most would have?" Bruce didn't look up. It didn't need to be handled any other way. The sergeant considered that. Men like him, he said, they don't take well to being humbled. He wasn't humbled, Bruce said. He was exposed. The sergeant exhaled. Yeah, maybe he was. He took another step forward. I've seen officers lose their tempers, seen worse, but I've never seen someone take a man's authority without touching his pride. You didn't humiliate him. No, Bruce agreed. He humiliated himself. A silence passed between them. Then the sergeant spoke again. You've spent time around power. Bruce finally lifted his eyes. I've seen what people become when they think they have it. The sergeant nodded thoughtfully. I'm guessing this wasn't your first standoff. Bruce said nothing. The sergeant reached into his pocket and pulled out a small slip of paper. He wrote something down, an address, perhaps a name, and set it on the bench beside Bruce. In case you ever need a friend in uniform, he said. Bruce didn't pick it up, didn't even glance at it. The sergeant didn't seem offended. He understood. Without another word, he turned and walked away. As he disappeared into the movement of the park, Bruce leaned back on the bench. The sunlight hit the water of the fountain just right, turning the air above it into golden mist. The jacaranda tree above him rustled in the soft breeze. The pages of his book fluttered gently. He reached down and turned one, then another, and began reading once again. The crowd had mostly dispersed. A few remained, seated nearby, not close enough to intrude, but near enough to feel the presence of something, or someone, who had changed the atmosphere. Even if they couldn't explain why, they knew. Bruce didn't need their validation. He didn't need their applause. He had lived long enough to know the difference between being seen and being understood. And this time, he had been understood. Across the square, the sergeant slowed his steps, looking back once. He saw Bruce as he truly was. Not a myth, not a story, not a ghost from the past, but a man who lived in stillness the way others lived in chaos. The last light of the day dipped below the rooftops. Bruce Lee remained seated, his presence undisturbed, as the city moved on around him. No badge, no title, no uniform, just truth. He didn't fight, he didn't shout, but today justice was served in the most powerful way, through calm, control, and truth. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and tell us where you're watching from.